A very good morning to all of you. Hope you are enjoying the conference. I'm very happy to introduce Professor Costas Azariadis to you. For most of us, he does not need any introduction, but let me tell you briefly about him. Professor Costas Azariadis is the Edward Malincrot Distinguished Professor in Arts and Science in the Washington University in St. Louis. He's also a Senior Research Fellow at the St. Louis Fed. He received his PhD from Carnegie Mellon University in the year 1975. He was associated with many top departments in the world. However, his long-term association was mainly with the UPenn and the UCLA. He was a full professor at UPenn till 1992, from where he moved as a distinguished professor at the UCLA. Now he's an emeritus professor there. He's also a fellow of the Econometric Society. Professor Azariadis is one of the most influential macroeconomists in the world. His fundamental research has helped us in understanding some of the basic economic phenomena in the context of labor market functioning, business cycle analysis, growth and development, financial market imperfection, asset pricing, and endogenous debt constraint. His influential implicit contract theory came out of his thesis. He has seminal research on the sunspot theory, and his model has become one of the most important models in this particular field. Costas' research also focuses on some long-run issues. His paper with Alan Drezen is one of the seminal papers in the new growth theory, where non-convexities in the aggregate production can generate multiple steady state, and therefore it can explain the growth trap or the club convergence kind of issues. His today's talk is, however, on a different aspect of growth theory. He'll talk about corruption, institutions, rent-seeking in a model of economic growth. So, without further delay, let me invite Costas to come to the floor.
Thank you, Moni. Truth in advertising requires me to say, don't believe everything you hear. The topic today is, okay, good. Somewhere, good. Thank you. Wow, I can't move at all. I have to move like this. Okay, so the topic today is kind of connected with poverty traps. Because when 28 years ago, when Alan Drezen and I started peddling this idea of there being hurdles to growth that countries had to overcome, and those hurdles had something to do with the technology of human capital accumulation, development economists were cool to the idea. And they said, no, it's not that. It's just bad politics. So today's paper is a backhanded way of saying maybe they had a point. Okay. All right. So this is a project that I'm doing with Yannis Ioannides. It's going to result in, there's no paper yet. There's 110 slides, but no paper. It's going to result in a book because we haven't quite nailed down the model. We've nailed down the ideas, but the issue is very complex, and the model that you need is, there's a variety of models that you could use, and haven't settled yet. Hold on. So the idea is to study corruption and rent seeking and see how they're connected or not connected with growth. So we think of corruption as official misbehavior, and rent seeking as private misbehavior. So these are two dominant types of anti-growth behavior. Both of these things are going to have a deleterious impact on growth. So we want to define what they are. We want to kind of think where do they come from, because we observe different amounts of corruption and seeking in different societies. So we want to know where they come from. They come from people, some people have a comparative advantage, rent-seeking behavior, and being rent seekers? Do they come from weak institutions? Do they come from, I don't know, the presence of cultural factors? How big are they? Nobody's going to report their income from rent-seeking or corruption. Can we find through our models a particular observable variable that's a good proxy for income from corruption or income from rent-seeking? And then the important question is this one here. How much do they hurt productivity and growth? We have lots of examples of corrupt societies growing and honest societies not growing, so it's not obvious which way the correlation goes. Is corruption something that perhaps affects measured total factor productivity or labor productivity? And then there's this thing here, this question down here, which is a fool's errand. Can we think of institutions and politics and growth as all being endogenous variables in a grand model? And the answer is, yeah, you can keep on dreaming. But anyway, we all know what corruption is in the popular press, so we don't need to go over that to conserve some time. And we know that in the literature, the names are rent-seeking, appropriation, extraction, etc., etc. So this kind of corruption typically means this thing here, the illegal use of public office for private gain. And then, of course, there is rent-seeking, which is simply the irregular distribution of income through bribes and even extortion, racketeering of the distribution of private income from one household or group of people to another household or group of people, not including the government. And you can think of the mafia as being a wonderful example of this. Okay, so here we're going to look at corruption and rent-seeking as occupational choices. We're going to live in a fantastic world where nobody's punished for being corrupt, okay, except loss of income. So you can fail as a rent seeker, or the person that you're trying to extract something from may manage to fend you off, but that's the maximum extent of your loss. We're not going to put you in jail, we're not going to shoot you, we're not going to do any of those things. So it's an occupational choice. You know what the incomes are, you know what the risks are. You can be corrupt, you can be honest, you can be a rent seeker, you can be a producer, you can be a good guy, you can be a bad guy, and it's all something that's a matter of occupational choice. Whatever works for you, right? That's what we're going to do. So we're going to let people make rational decisions, roughly decisions that under perfect capital markets maximize their life cycle income. So whatever maximizes your life cycle income is going to be your occupational choice, modulo something that goes beyond individual considerations, that will allow people, when they look at the payoff, for this payoff not just to be life cycle income, but also to be influenced by social norms. In other words, what does society expect of you? You could, in principle, make a very large income by being a member of the mafia. But if your brothers will not break bread with you, or your mother will not talk to you, there's something that you have to take into account. So it's not just your payoff is not just your private income, but your private income plus something about interactions with society, which impose a tax on you if you deviate too much from social norms. So you can have societies that are completely individualistic, where people don't care about norms. That's one extreme, okay? You maximize life cycle income, and that's it. And or at the other end, you can be in a society where norms are extremely important, okay, and they impose an externality on you. And you deviate from these norms even slightly, the negative externality is too large. So in other words, you've got to do what society tells you to do. And these two extremes are two very different societies. An individualist society behaves like a standard growth model. And a traditionalist society behaves very much differently from a growth model. So, in particular, what's going to be the main result here is something very simple, which actually I don't need to give you 108 slides. But I would like to torture you, so I'll do that too. So the main idea is very, very simple. In an individual society, the outcome of the growth process depends very much on the political choice of norms. If somehow you manage to push through society good norms, good institutions, strong property rights, if society decides to go for strong property rights, then society goes for growth. Things are going to be good. If not, not. And then the interesting thing is, which societies decide to go for good institutions, or under what circumstances do we go this way or that way? So it's a question of politics and growth. This is simple. At the other extreme, where social norms are very important, where the strong externalities or social interactions, institutions are not important. It's because you don't have much freedom of choice. Because the norms are very important, because you cannot deviate. You can think of this as a collectivist society or an oppressive society, call it whatever you like. Because the penalty from deviating from what's expected of you is so large, you will do what's expected of you. And what's expected of you is a norm that's defined from the past. Okay? Traditionalism. In this particular case, institutions don't matter very much, and in extreme cases, they don't matter at all. What matters is your past. So this is like a poverty trap. If you have a bad past, if your norms are anti-growth, you're condemned. You're a prisoner of your past. A good past guarantees a good future. Bad past guarantees a bad future. And even if you could break out of the past in these societies, you can only do so by an enormous change in institutions. So by strengthening property rights, for instance, enormously, to raise the rate of return on productive activity. But that turns out to be politically very difficult. So if you're going to say that I'm going to change institutions from very weak defense of property rights to very strong, or vice versa, or in the other direction, that's going to be politically very hard, because there's going to be lots of political reaction against it. So basically you have, these are the basic results, and I'm going to spend the rest of the time torturing you, okay? All right. So institutions here are going to be chosen collectively. So institutions are chosen through a political process. And I have to write down something about the political process. And I'm not a very good political scientist. Okay, that's not my comparative advantage. So the way I'm going to model it is that there's always going to be a binary choice. Population is going to vote over two alternatives. One is a status quo, which, if you think about trying to reform the French economy or the Italian economy, you know that the status quo is very important. So one of them is going to be the status quo. The other is some reform proposal that the political system throws up every so often. So Renzi comes as a prime minister and says, I want this, and he doesn't get it. So how what the political system throws up as a reform depends on who controls the agenda. And that's kind of a complicated thing. In order for me to avoid it, I will assume that the political system throws up a random reform proposal every period. So if proposals can be thought of as a distribution on the interval 0, 1, we pick a random number in the interval 0, 1 and throw it up. Okay? And that's the reform proposal. On the other hand, there's a status quo, the institutions we inherited from the past. So we vote over those two, and if we obtain a supermajority, we can change the status quo. Without a supermajority, we cannot change the status quo, which actually makes an equilibrium difficult to pass reform proposals, but not impossible. So this is going to be the politics. It's going to be very simple. Okay, so let's keep going. We have until, what, 10:30? Yeah. More or less? Okay, good. Fine. So, so there's going to be norms. A norm is going to be a parameter in the interval 0, 1. So 0 is going to be, we don't tolerate corruption at all, and 1 is going to be, we don't tolerate honesty at all. Norms may or may not be important. There's going to be a cultural parameter sigma here, this one. In 0 infinity or 0, 1, it doesn't really matter, which captures the strength of social interactions. So sigma 0 means, well, you live in an individualist society, so whatever norms there are, we don't give a damn about them, okay? We look after number 1. And if sigma is the largest value, could be infinity or 1, then it means that norms are all important. So the way you think about it is basically that there is an implied tax rate. Okay, every time you deviate from the norm, so you take a decision on rho, and rho is going to be the fraction of individuals, or the fraction of the time individuals are going to spend rent seeking. So rho 0 means no rent seeking, okay? And rho 1 means all the time you're a rent seeker, full-time rent seeker, okay? So every time you deviate from the norm, you pay a tax, and the tax is the distance, your distance from the norm times sigma, okay? So sigma is like a tax rate. So if sigma is large, deviations from the norms are punished severely in terms of your mother doesn't talk to you. Okay. If sigma is close to 0, then, you know. Okay, so this is going to be, the other thing is going to be a property rights or institutional parameter, theta. This is going to be endogenous. This is exogenous. This is endogenous. This is going to be endogenous. So politics is going to decide this parameter. And this is a property rights parameter which defines the ratio of enforcement personnel to rent seekers. In this society, some people are going to choose to be rent seekers. And society is going to try to control rent seekers. Think of them as mafia, thieves. We have cops. And the institution is this. How many cops do we put on the street for every mafia member that we know exists? So there can be no tolerance of crime, in which case this theta is large here. So if theta, there's an upper bound on theta, and if you put out 1 cop for each thief, crime vanishes. Okay. Now remember, you're not fixing the number of cops on the street. You're fixing how strongly you react to the presence of antisocial behavior. Okay? So I can have this policy. Well, the other extreme is theta equals 0. I don't care. You go do whatever you want. Okay? We are not fixing the total number of cops. So if you're in a society where everybody's an angel, okay, where there's no crime, there's no cops. But this choice will have a deterrent effect on people's calculations. Do I want to be a rent seeker or do I want to be a producer? So if you say, for every thief, I'm going to put a cop out, and when I decide whether I want to be an honest person or a thief, I will take that into account. Because if there are lots of cops per thief, then perhaps my chances of getting a good income as a thief just went down. Okay. So I don't need to tell you very much about the correlation between GDP per capita and corruption. Here we need to get much better data, more sophisticated data. But there's a strong correlation. So if you look at Transparency International qualitative indices of corruption, they're strongly correlated with GDP. It would be nicer. And the next version, there's going to be a scatter plot of some sort. Show this correlation. So does corruption limit GDP? This is a debate in development economics, which I'm not going to go into. I think it's those who are aligned on the side that says corruption limits GDP are overwhelmingly stronger than the others, even though there's some arguments to be made in the other direction. But the bottom line is this, that corruption and rent-seeking are redistributive activities. They're not productive activities. So to the extent that the society decides to spend a lot of labor and capital either engaging in rent-seeking or trying to deter rent-seeking, okay? To the same extent, society does not allow these people to go into production and increase GNP. So here, basically, it's corruption is going to be a redistributive activity that hurts GDP. So it's socially inefficient for many reasons. First of all, strong deterrence would destroy corruption without spending any actual resources. You will say that for every thief I have 10 cops out there, and that kills crime, and it costs you nothing, because nobody will choose to be a thief, and therefore you need no cops. Everybody's a producer, so total income is going to go up. Gainers can afford to compensate the losers, and our only problem is everybody will be better off if adequately compensated. And that's going to be a big if in this model, because we will not have a mechanism for compensating the losers. We could say, look, you guys are mafia workers. I know you're kids from the Italian South. You're not very well educated. If you were to do honest work, you get €1,000 a month, which means you kind of be hungry. And now you're in the mafia, you make €3,000 a month, and you live comfortably. So what we're going to do is we're going to let you go and find honest work, and we're going to give you 2 extra thousand. We're going to compensate you. And if we do that, then the honest citizens will be up in arms saying, my God, you paying these mafia guys 2 extra thousand out of my taxes? No. So this is the underlying assumption, that you don't have a mechanism for compensating the losers, and that's the source of all your problems. So reforms will be vetoed by the uncompensated people who have some comparative advantage in rent-seeking. So the labor unions, I don't want to put the labor unions together with the mafia, but there's lots of social strata that are going to lose from reforms, okay? And they vote for various politicians, and I'm not going to identify those politicians either. All right, so they're going to be vetoed. Fine. So why do we tolerate corruption? It's because primarily, there are lots of stories in the literature, but primarily it's going to be that because it's not easy to get broad-based agreement that reforms are in order. Reforms get proposed. The French government, the Italian government have voted many reforms in their countries, but not, or the Greek government for that matter, but very little has been implemented. Okay? So one thing we want to explain is, why do we see good institutions persisting? The world, if you look at, I should have given you serial correlation of Transparency International numbers for all the countries. And what we know from anecdotal observation is that the well-governed countries of today were well-governed 10 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. And In the British case, it goes back a long, long time. Okay? Also, the badly governed countries have very persistent politics. That doesn't mean things don't change. Singapore improved the quality of its governance in the 60s, and various countries in kind of Mediterranean Europe that will remain unnamed also allowed their Transparency International scores to drop precipitously in the last 20 years. The same countries have had very bad growth experiences. Perhaps it's just a coincidence. Surveys, etc. There's a huge literature here, both on the economic side and on the kind of social, cultural norm side, habit side, trust side of this. There's papers that are referred to in these notes and other important papers like Bizine and Verdier and some Abellini's work that are not. There's a large amount of theoretical models, the key ones being Grossman and Kim is one of them, Scaperdas is another, of that study the corruption, in particular the study rent-seeking. So these are models which are kind of, they're mostly atemporal, some growth models. And when you talk about rent-seeking, it's typically modeled as a game between a predator and her prey. So there's a person who has income, a person who wants to gain that income or steal it, and the predator invests in offensive weapons, and the prey invests in defensive weapons, and then the probability that the income changes hands from the predator or the prey depends on these two investments, okay? And they play this game. So this is typically a situation where the predation is private. There's no government involved in these early models. And then defense is also private. There's no police involved. So there's a kind of lots of papers in this literature. So here we're going to, do it slightly differently. The rent-seeking is going to be private. Corruption is going to be public. The defense against both is going to be completely public. So you cannot hire private cops or anything like that. So what we want to do is actually, and I can spend a couple of minutes explaining kind of the motivation. It's not just to say something about corruption, but it's an attempt to understand the engines of growth that are not strictly economic. So when you do growth theory in economics, you think about human capital, accumulation, you think about physical capital, you think about invention and innovation, you think about quality ladders, you think about creative destruction. All these are things that permit you to accumulate more factors of production or to improve the technology. So here, the attempt is, when you put these factors on the right-hand side of the growth regression, you only explained half of growth or less. Most of the growth you explain is through changes in TFP. So because you're not explaining the growth very well, growth regressions use funny variables on the right-hand side, dummy variables like a continental dummy, ethno-linguistic diversity. You hear all these kind of non-economic or cultural terms being used, or variables. And so what we want to understand is, if we lay aside human capital accumulation, if we lay aside physical capital accumulation, what else is there? Okay? So it's an attempt to understand the non-economic factors that underlie the growth process, in particular institutions and culture. So what we're going to do is, as first step, we're going to fix the institutions and, in this case, property rights, take them as exogenous, and then see how people line up. What do people choose? So if I give you good institutions or bad institutions,